Are you awake enough yet? That was wonderful. Thank you, choir and Noreen and everybody. And good morning.
Good morning.
One evening, two elderly couples were having dinner together in one of their homes. After dinner, the men sat at the table. The women went into the kitchen. The men were talking with each other, and one of them said to the other, "You know, we went to a really great restaurant last night. I highly recommend it." The other man said, "Really? Well, what's the name of the restaurant?" He thought and thought and thought. And then he said, "What's the name of that red flower? You know, the one that you give to people you love?" The other one said, "You mean a carnation?" "No, not that one. The other one." "You mean a poppy?" No. The red one that has thorns." His friend said, "Oh, you mean a rose?" He said, "Yes." Then he turned to the kitchen and he yelled, "Rose, what's the name of that restaurant we went to?" I'm hoping that's as funny 15 years from now as it is today. I also came across a cartoon as I was preparing my lesson, and the cartoon was Mary on the donkey, Joseph leading the donkey. They're standing in front of the inn, and there's a big no vacancy sign. And Mary is saying to Joseph, "See, I told you we needed to make reservations." Well, here at Unity, at Christmas time, we not only celebrate the birth of Jesus, but, as I've already shared, we also celebrate what we call the birth of the Christ in us. One of my friends said that they were an adult before they realized that Christ wasn't Jesus' last name, but rather a title that he could claim because he became aware of his divinity. And of course, that's the same for us. That inner birth in us happens every time we experience one of the four main aspects of God, which I pointed out in our meditation this morning: divine love, divine power of creation, divine wisdom, and divine aliveness. The first time I consciously had an experience of oneness with one of these qualities was back in 1971. I had gotten married a couple, 3 months before that, and I already knew that it wasn't going well in my marriage. This is my first wife and I. And I also had changed jobs, and I was selling things on the road that I didn't know how to sell, and I didn't know the products. I was miserable. The minister that morning in church, this was before I found Unity, the minister that morning in church gave a talk on the idea of God's will, saying God's will for you is better than anything you could come up with on your own. I thought to myself, what the heck? I sure have made a mess of things trying to figure this out on my own. And I had a moment of just total surrender. And as soon as I did, I heard a voice say, "You are going to be a minister," as plainly as if I'm talking to you. I turned around. There wasn't anybody talking. After the service, I told my then wife what had happened, and she said, "Well, that could mean anything. You could be a minister no matter what you're doing." I said, "I know, but you know what? I think it was literal." And fortunately, it was. It took me 3 years to find Unity. Then I found myself feeling at home and knew that I had found my calling. But that was my first conscious experience of the birth of the Christ. The birth of the Christ in us happens over and over and over again. In Matthew 1, the Holy Spirit said to Joseph, "You shall call his name Yeshua," or Ishwa, "for he will save his people from their sins." I love Jesus. And I'm with Charles and Myrtle on this one, our co-founders. They love Jesus too. In my life, Jesus saves me every single day. Not from a literal hell. Bishop John Shelby Spong, the great theologian and Bible scholar, in his latest book, he says, Christianity needs to either change or die, or it will die. And he says the thing that Christianity most needs to let go of is the bankrupt concept that Jesus died for our sins to save us from an imaginary, eternal roasting oven. And I totally agree with that. So I don't mean that Jesus saves me from a literal hell, but as I tune into Jesus' teachings and his example, he saves me every day from hurting myself and from feeling separate from God and from you. Jesus taught us how to transform our lives from fear-based to love and God-filled. And he taught us how to accept our own Christhood, our own divinity, how to be the light in our own world. One time when I was the associate minister at Unity in Honolulu, Terry Cole Whitaker came to visit. And at the time, she had the largest New Thought congregation in the world in San Diego. And she gave a lecture. And then after the lecture, she had a question and answer period. And someone asked her, Reverend Terry, when can we expect the second coming of Christ? She looked at him and she said, "You're it. And we've been waiting for you." And that also reminded me of an experience I had when I was the minister in Charlotte, North Carolina at the Unity Church. I was a member of an interfaith group there, interfaith ministry group. And one day we were having a discussion. It was a small group of us. And one of the participants was a Baptist minister. We were talking about slavery days in the South. Of course, we were right in the South. And the discussion was how the slave owners treated their slaves like dirt during the week, and then insisted they go to church on Sunday. They didn't care whether they lived in hell now, but they wanted to make sure they weren't in hell after they died. So they didn't care about, Jesus' teachings and following Jesus' teachings, only about, what would happen after death. And as we were talking, the Baptist minister sitting next to me said, somewhere along the line, we stopped believing that we could follow Jesus, and we started worshiping him instead. I looked at her, and my mouth was hanging open. And she looked back at me because she could see me looking at her, and she said, "Well, we're not all crazy, Accepting our Christhood, expressing our divine nature in daily life, begins with an inner birth. And at Christmas time, I like to share the metaphysical or inner meaning of the original Christmas story. The birth takes place in the manger of our hearts because there's no room in the inn of our intellect. The symbolism is this: to our ego mind, our human mind, the heart is vastly inferior to the intellect, but not to the spiritual part of us. Charles Fillmore used to like to say that the intellect is the seat of ego mind. The next symbols are Jesus' parents. They both represent aspects of this inner birth. First, we have Joseph. Joseph represents the enlightened intellect. The enlightened intellect knows that its job is not to unite with Mary. It's not to decide what to do. Its true job, it knows, is to listen to the Holy Spirit and carry out what the Holy Spirit says. Then, of course, we have Mary. Mary symbolizes our feeling side. She represents two seeming opposites. First of all, in Hebrew, the name Mary means something that you might not expect. It means bitter complaint, contentiousness. How's that? So Mary symbolizes what our beloved minister Eric Butterworth used to call divine discontent. When we're living in our fear-based mind, that's the feeling there has to be a better way than this. The other thing Mary represents, the other side of what she represents, comes from that wonderful soliloquy where she says, "My soul magnifies the Lord." Whenever I read that, I think to myself, what that means, my soul magnifies the Lord, means my soul magnifies the divine qualities in me, the love, the power, the wisdom, aliveness. And whenever I read that, the thought that it brings up for me is, what does my soul magnify? And for you, what does yours magnify? This inner birth takes place when Herod is the king. In biblical symbolism, the king always represents our ruling ego state of mind. When we say to our human mind, I have experienced the birth of the Christ, Herod in us, our ego mind, says, first of all, it's threatened. And it says, well, who do you think you are? Do I have to remind you of your past? Do I have to remind you of how flawed you are? But Mary and Joseph in us protect the newborn realization from Herod. Mary and Joseph in us say to us, no, past is not who you are, and you are not only human. And they say your heart will lead you to true success, true joy, and true peace by letting the Holy Spirit in you guide you. The birth takes place in Bethlehem. And in Hebrew, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. This represents that God in us, God in me, is the one source of everything that feeds me, everything that nurtures me. God in me actually is the one source of everything I want in life. Wise men come to visit. They bring gold and frankincense and myrrh. Gold represents the richness, the wealth of spirit. Frankincense brings a realization of the beauty of spirit. And myrrh brings a realization of the eternality of spirit. There's a rumor that there was a fourth wise man who brought fruitcake. But that's never been confirmed. The what? Maybe I did. Maybe I started that rumor. The wise men say, we have seen his star in the east. Metaphysically, the east always represents the within, and the west represents the without. The wise parts of us know to look to God within for wisdom, not to the outer world of appearances, opinions, and the past. In the Bible story, Herod never sees the star, even though, of course, it's in the same sky, that he could have seen. And what that means is that our ego mind, our human mind, never looks up beyond our intellect and beyond our past experiences for wisdom. And finally, the Christ in us begins as an infant. This means that we must nurture this new realization and protect it from the ego mind. This awakening to our divinity is fragile at first. One of my colleagues, when she leads Christmas candle lighting services, always likes to give out to everybody who's there a raw egg and says, keep that egg with you for a whole week. That will give you some idea of how much you need to protect that new realization of the Christ in you. But as we nurture the newborn Christ, this awareness grows. It gets stronger and stronger, and eventually it begins to guide and nurture us. Here's what Isaiah has to say, just a few words. For unto us a child is born within us. Unto us a son is given, and the government of our lives shall be upon his shoulder, and his name, which means his nature, will be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. So this Christmas, join us in this inner birth. Ask your inner Mary to unite with the Holy Spirit in you, and then rejoice every time that Christ is born in you. And as I said, it is born over and over and over again. I've had so many births of the Christ in my life, but I wanted to share one more of what I think of as one of the more dramatic ones. This one also happened when I was a minister in Hawaii. Back in those days, it was like the early 80s. I was still smoking, like 2 packs of cigarettes a day. And I used to like to go to a restaurant called the Yum Yum Tree. And they had an indoor part and an outdoor part. I sat in the outdoor part because it was a smoking section. And I'd sit there each morning, drink coffee and smoke, read whatever I was reading, and, before I went to the office. One day as I was doing that, there was a man sitting a little ways away, and in a loud voice he said, "Why don't you quit smoking and give the whole world a break?" Well, I was incensed. I was in my right place. I was in the smoking section. I felt righteous. Another of my friends says, you know what happens whenever you feel righteous? The next thing you get to feel is wroncious. So I left, and about a day later, I realized, you know what? He's just saying out loud what I'm feeling inside me. It's time to stop smoking. About a month later, I quit. And after about 6 months of being a non-smoker, I ran across this guy. And I said, I just want to thank you. Because you spoke my mind, and I didn't even know that was going on within me. I had first felt like a victim, but about a day later, I awoke to realize I was not a victim. This was the result of the power of creation in me, that I created this. And that's true, I believe, for each one of us. When we realize that life doesn't happen to us, but rather through us, that is the birth of the Christ as our divine power of creation. Usually, these inner births don't happen with lights flashing and horns blowing. Not even in that case, which was pretty loud, but it happened later on in the manger of my heart. When they happen quietly in that manger in our hearts, they whisper, divine love is who I am. Will you know that with me? Divine love is who I am. Divine power of creation is who I am. Divine power of creation is who I am. Divine wisdom is who I am. Divine wisdom is who I am. Eternal aliveness is who I am. Together? Eternal aliveness is who I am. The more you nurture these inner births, the more the Christ in you will take charge of your life, and the happier and more joy-filled your life will be. Namaste.